The scream never carried far in that building, not over the rattle of streetcars and the grind of Chicago's South Side. Inside the three-story structure at 63rd and Wallace, doors shut the way doors are supposed to. Latches clicked. Hallways turned unexpectedly. A man who introduced himself as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes moved through it with calm purpose, smiling at customers in the front and keeping the back rooms private. Holmes arrived in Chicago in the mid-1880s, when the city was swelling with new money and new strangers. He drifted through jobs in pharmacies and medicine, presenting himself as educated, polished, and trustworthy. By 1886, he was working at a drugstore near Englewood, and soon after the owner died, Holmes maneuvered to take control of the business. He began buying and borrowing under different names, juggling creditors and telling different stories to different people. What he wanted most was a place he controlled completely. Construction started on the building that would later be branded in headlines as a murder castle, though the name came after the fact. Holmes hired crews, fired them, hired new ones, and kept plans fragmented so no one worker understood the full layout. The structure included storefront space on the ground level and rooms above, and Holmes insisted on locks, partitions, and odd interior changes. Tenants later described confusing corridors and rooms that did not connect normally. Chicago newspapers would soon turn those details into something darker, but even in its ordinary state, it was a building designed for one person's advantage. Holmes's advantage was not only architectural, he was a serial fraudster. He took out insurance policies, sold goods he did not own, and used false identities to keep himself moving ahead of consequences. When the World's Columbian Exposition drew crowds in 1893, Englewood filled with visitors looking for work and lodging. Holmes advertised rooms. He also employed young women at his pharmacy, cultivating loyalty, then isolating them from friends and family with promises and pressure. He proposed marriages he did not mean to honor. He used paperwork, debt, and charm the way other criminals used force. Several women connected to Holmes vanished during those years. Among them was Julia Smythe Connor, who worked in the building and became involved with him. She and her young daughter Pearl disappeared around the end of 1891. Holmes told different stories about where they had gone. Another woman, Emmeline Sigrand, his stenographer, vanished in late 1892 after he brought her to Chicago. Families asked questions. Holmes supplied answers that led nowhere. At the time, there was no centralized system to catch a pattern of disappearances. People came to Chicago and vanished for many reasons. Holmes made sure his reasons sounded plausible. His crimes eventually tightened around money and insurance, and that is where the case became concrete. In 1894, Holmes met Benjamin Petezel, a carpenter and small-time con man. The two discussed schemes, including insurance fraud. Holmes convinced Petezel to take out a life insurance policy and allow Holmes to profit from it. Petezel had a wife and children, and he trusted Holmes enough to follow his instructions. In September 1894, in Philadelphia, Petezel was killed. Holmes claimed it was part of a fake death plan, but the evidence showed Petezel was murdered for real, his body staged to look like an accident. After Petezel's death, Holmes moved quickly to control the aftermath. He kept contact with Petezel's widow, Carrie, promising money. He also took custody of 3 of Petezel's children under the pretense of moving them and reuniting the family. Instead, he carried them through a trail of rented rooms and temporary addresses across the Midwest and into Canada, always one step ahead of questions. The children, Howard, Alice, and Nellie, became leverage in Holmes's scheme, and then, when leverage was no longer useful, they became liabilities. Investigators began circling Holmes because of the insurance angle and because other swindlers had seen him double-cross partners. In 1894, Holmes was arrested in Boston on an unrelated matter tied to theft and fraud. Pinkerton detectives were involved, and once they learned his connection to Petezel, the case widened. Holmes tried to talk his way out of it. He offered partial truths, then shifted stories, then blamed others. But the trail of rents, tickets, letters, and witnesses followed him anyway. The search for the Pitzel children led to the most devastating discoveries. In Toronto, investigators found evidence in the home Holmes had rented that suggested Alice and Nellie had been killed there, and their remains were later recovered. In Indianapolis, detectives traced Holmes to another rented house. In the cellar, they found the remains of young Howard Pitzel. Holmes had kept the boy with him, moving him through cities while writing to Carrie as if the children were safe. The cruelty was not theatrical, it was transactional. Holmes treated trust as a tool and life as an obstacle. With those findings, Holmes's web snapped into public view. Chicago authorities searched the Inglewood building. Newspapers flooded the city with lurid descriptions: secret passages, trapdoors, chutes, sealed rooms, and devices for killing. Some features were real, some were exaggerated, and some could not be verified later. What was verifiable was that Holmes controlled the building, controlled the people around him, and had used that control to deceive, isolate, and destroy. The myth of the murder castle grew because the reality was already terrifying. A man could hide crimes in plain sight while presenting himself as respectable. Holmes was returned to Philadelphia for trial in the murder of Benjamin Pitzel. The proceedings in 1895 cut through the smoke. Witnesses testified to Holmes's movements, his lies, his money trails, and the condition of Pitzel's body. Holmes took the stand and performed confidence, but the evidence held. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Even then, he continued to manipulate attention. He gave shifting confessions, at times claiming dozens of victims, sometimes more than 100, then changing details. Much of it was unreliable. What remained solid were the confirmed murders tied to the Pitzel case and the disappearances that followed Holmes's reach. After his conviction, reporters tried to tie every missing person in Chicago to Holmes, and the numbers ballooned. Holmes fed it, enjoying the confusion, but later reviews found many supposed victims had no clear connection to him. The building itself changed hands, and former employees contradicted one another about what they had seen. Some of the most sensational claims, like elaborate gas chambers or a fully engineered system built solely for killing, remain disputed. What is not disputed is the pattern of manipulation. Holmes targeted people who trusted him, pulled them into his orbit through work or promises, cut them off from support, and then erased them with lies that delayed discovery. In the end, it was paperwork and persistence, not rumors, that brought him down. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was executed. Chicago's castle was later damaged by fire and eventually demolished. Yet the story did not disappear because it captured something the city had feared all along, that the danger was not always the stranger in an alley. Sometimes it wore a suit, spoke gently, signed papers, and built a maze where people walked in and did not walk back out. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.